Hello, good morning and welcome. It's Wednesday, May the 14th. My name is Anne McEvoy from Politico.
And I'm Sam Coates of Sky News. Welcome to Politics at Sam and Anne's, the podcast that gives you everything you need to know about the day ahead in British politics in under 20 minutes, just in time for your commute.
And today is one of those days where what happens in the backrooms matters perhaps more than what is going on in front of camera. Sure, there is Prime Minister's questions, that old brawl. There's a government and an announcement about moving civil servants out of London. But really, Sam, there's a lot of watching and waiting, isn't there, on the EU reset that is coming on Monday, on Ukraine peace talks, and looking ahead to the Westminster vote on assisted dying on Friday after the Scottish equivalent made it through Holyrood last night with a majority of 14. Also, a shout out for a great story in the FT about concerns in government about the overhaul of the NHS and the pace and scope of that. Wes Streeting's key reform plans said to be so uninspiring at present that they've sacked the author and are looking for new ideas to boost it.
I do find it a little disconcerting, Anne, when policy making comes down to a hunt for, what was the phrase from the Blair era? Eye-catching initiatives, where it's not about...
With which I am personally associated, to finish the quote.
Exactly. It isn't about structural change that is right, as boring as that can be for most people, but instead it's about something that'll grab the headlines, grab the newspaper and media talking points, which is never quite my understanding of why we do these big changes, and I don't quite understand why we need to focus on the sort of media announcement rather than the change that underlies it. So I find all of that a bit weird. I also find that the weird thing in this story as well is that we seem to be all blaming the authors, the people writing the NHS 10-year plan. So yes, the FT reports that they've sidelined one author and have sort of found another. But this feels a little bit like blaming the deputies. You know, isn't it Wes Streeting who is meant to have come up with an overall structural reform plan for the NHS based on his principles before the election? I mean, I was always very, very struck by that quote from Wes Streeting just before Christmas. You know, it's not like I have a reform plan sitting in my top right-hand drawer. A little bit of me have always wondered, you know, why not? And now instead, quite a lot of the promise of change of the NHS seems to come down to changes in the NHS app being done and delivered through Wes Streeting's friend Peter Kyle. But there was a sort of plan for, you know, proper changes to the way the NHS work, and I'm a bit mystified about quite what's going on with all of that, but I'm sure it'll...
Well, I think I can lift a bit of a veil on what's been going on behind the scenes there. And you're absolutely right to point out there's, I wouldn't say it's a tension, but I think it's a kind of almost a necessary to and fro between having something eye-catching or pretty, simple to retail about NHS reform, Sam. I don't think you can simply have a lengthy paper which talks about data set improvements for patient care outcomes, etc. Living a bit in this world of jargon for a lot of years, covering health policy. You have to have something more. So perhaps I'm a bit more sympathetic there to Wes Streeting, saying I need something. This, after all, is going to be something the government has put relatively a lot of resource into. They absolutely need something that they can sell at the next election as a success or as a path to improvement. Behind the scenes, however, there are quite a lot of, I think there's quite a lot of debate, to put it politely, about how to implement these big technological changes, which are key to driving efficiencies in the NHS. I think most people agree, whether they're laymen or lay people, I should say, or experts. You can't just go on doing the same old system and pour more money into it and hope it gets better. When you say the app, I think the app is like the front of house symptom of the fact that we do need massive upgrade of data sets to guide the better clinical outcomes that we need in the NHS. How to get there and the many pitfalls that come with everything called data sets, apps, and of course patient security about their data is a bit of a minefield. There should be, and you're absolutely right, there should be and should have been more considered work about this earlier, but here we are, and I think that's what's going on behind the scenes.
Well, we'll wait and see. I suspect that that needs to come out. They said late spring for the NHS 10-year plan. So time is ticking. We look forward to it soon. By the way, last night I picked up that we could get the defence review as early as next week. So
Hmm.
as we
So
move on
something's running
apace.
on time. Well, nearly on time.
Yeah, I think there's a lot going on behind the scenes, as we were saying in government. And I just want to pick up one other thing that will look a little bit like a structural change for those that live and work in Westminster. You mentioned a moment ago that the government's got an announcement today about moving civil servants out of London. Another part of it is closing down some of the big buildings in London that civil servants work in at the moment in order to get something like 10,000 of them, 12,000 of them out of London. But that includes one of the most iconic, but brutally one of the most ugly buildings in Whitehall around Westminster is going to be shut down by Pat McFadden. It goes by the unprepossessing name 102 Petty France, and it's a 1970s polygon-shaped building opposite St James's Tube that is currently the home to the Ministry of Justice and all the sort of associated agencies like the CPS. It's just the most monstrous carbuncle, to borrow a phrase from King Charles, and a one-time home to the Home Office before John Reid declared it unfit for purpose and split it away from the Ministry of Justice. Talking to people who work in there, they like the views, but it is not going to be missed as a place of work. So Keir Starmer going to jailbreak all the civil servants in there, part of his programme of early release more generally.
Well, they're certainly being released out of London because the aim is that drive to get more civil service jobs out of the capital. The Cabinet Office is saying this morning they're going to create 3 major new government campuses. Manchester and Aberdeen are 2 of them. Of course, the Treasury has already moved tranches of its civil servants up to Teesside. The number of London-based civil servants will then reduce by 12,000. I think we're all wondering where the running total is, how many civil servants are overall employed. But 12,000 is a great bunch of them, and that will happen by 2030. Now, I wonder, does spreading jobs across the country or maybe working remotely make people more efficient?
Well, we're never in the same office to do this podcast, so I'm not sure we can judge that too harshly. I mean, frankly, we're rarely in the same country, Anne, when we join each other each morning. So I can see from the hotel curtains behind you that you are out and about again this morning. So for listeners of a certain age, I'm going to call you our very own Keith Chegwin. Where are you this morning, Anne, and why?
I'm in my old stomping ground of Eastern Central Europe. In fact, I'm in Poznan in Poland and taking a look at the presidential elections due here on Sunday. In the butterfly wings way of these things, Sam, they do have a bit of an impact actually on the UK and on the alliances that Keir Starmer is trying to pull together or reconnect, as he would call it, with some of our former EU colleagues now that we're in the Brexit era, but also in the Ukraine war and post-Ukraine war era. And one of the things that's happening here is you've got these presidential elections. Very short version is that the lead candidate, Mr. Trzaskowski, the Warsaw mayor, is allied to the Prime Minister, Donald Tusk. If he does take the presidency on Sunday, the old president, Andrzej Duda, is retiring at the end of his term. That would sort of consolidate power in the centre in Poland and see off a lot of the further right. A lot easier then for Tusk to get his business through. And it hits the UK in lots of ways, whether it's youth mobility scheme, we might have a word about that in a moment, migration as a whole and the knock-ons of one country's asylum and migration on another, how to support Ukraine, how to deter Russia if and when that peace deal is signed. I think we don't actually hear enough from Poland because it is one of the quad of 4 countries with France, Germany, the UK now firmly involved in that, acting together and in concert. So it's always worth taking a look at what happens here.
It is interesting because Central and Eastern European countries are having such a big effect on the debate over Ukraine in particular at the moment. Earlier in the week, there was the story that if Hungary continued to play hardball over Russian sanctions, which expire from an EU perspective at the end of the summer, then the EU might have to change the entire legal basis for the way it takes action against Russia because it wouldn't have the complete support of every single member state. It really is tricky. This looks and sounds from what you say as if Poland might go back in a slightly more conventional direction, which I think feels like good news for Keir Starmer and for Britain if they're trying to negotiate a sort of softer
Indeed.
reset. Let's start with that EU reset. Clearly, although the EU reset summit is on Monday, there is still stuff to nail down ahead of it. And later this week, Keir Starmer's going to head off to Albania and apparently he's going to still be holding 11th hour bilateral talks with other leaders to get some of the bits over the line. Now, we're told that this isn't big bits of the jigsaw currently unresolved, but it is specific wording. But as everybody who listens to this podcast should know, the specific wording negotiated at the last minute actually is often the meat of the deal that then gets fleshed out over months and years after that. So it really, really, really matters. So you might have 90% of a deal, but the precise wording will determine whether or not it's a big thing or a small thing. Now, I'm very struck this morning by someone telling the FT that actually negotiations are in a worse place than they were a week ago. The closer it gets to the deadline, the more the Brits are asking for. That's not a productive dynamic.
Oh, I wish they would not use this language. Of course, it's a productive dynamic. That's how a negotiation gets done. Dear EU diplomat, whoever you may be, that's exactly what happens, isn't it? It's, as Abba so rightly put it, a big thing or a small, the winner takes it all. You could tell, however, that things weren't entirely straightforward when we learned yesterday from Buckingham Palace the French President Emmanuel Macron and his wife Brigitte will be treated to a full 3-day state visit in July. That's including 2 nights at Windsor Castle. You could call that the full works with 2 breakfasts. And we're reaching for that bauble, I think, Sam, at a critical point in the talks, just as the French have been playing hardball over fisheries, if you can play hardball with a fish. But you get my idea. You know, it's just been quite a tricky one, that. And I think everyone, and also I know from my German sources, they've been slightly worried about that sort of throwing everything else off. So there's clearly something hard to negotiate there. I'm also fascinated, by the way, we are now really rolling out these pledges of state visits. Donald Trump, of course, due later in the year, when we need to get these deals over the line. The visits have become, we always talk about them being flummery and glitz, but really these are our last weapon. These are the long-range missiles of our trade deal and broader negotiations with the EU. Will it work? Well, let's see. But it does look like there is still that stumbling block over the fishing deal.
Yeah, no, we really are rinsing King Charles for everything we can get out of him and the royal family. I mean, I did find it a bit incredible. I didn't know this, Anne. That I mean, even as we're preparing for the second state visit for Donald Trump, which we know, I think, was coming in September some point, that President Macron of France has never had a state visit in the 8 years he's been in the Elysee Palace. It's his first. I suppose that's because, how can we put it gently, UK-French relations have not exactly been incredibly smooth since he took over as president in 2017. You know, a lot of that was the utter turmoil of Brexit for many, many years, and followed by the pandemic. But that's quite a long time. So in a sense, that's giving him something you would expect a French president to get a little bit before. But back onto the substance of it, yes, it feels like the French are playing hardball over fisheries. The exact sticking point seems to be that the UK wants a kind of a deal to make it easier to get, basically to help our food sector and our agriculture sector. But the French are saying, well, if you're going to time limit any changes to the fisheries sort of deal, then we want to time limit the deal that we give you over agriculture. And Britain doesn't like that because one of the big wins it wants to be able to sell is a reduction in food prices. But if there's uncertainty for the agriculture sector and the food sector, then prices are much less likely to come down. So that's the area of contention over that. Another big area of contention is over the youth mobility scheme, which the EU is desperate for, particularly the Germans, as you've been saying on this podcast this week. Now, we know that there's not going to be a fully fleshed out deal on Monday. It's more like the sort of heads of terms. It's the direction of travel. But even so, that's still being hammering out. What are you hearing on that, Anne?
Well, that's very significant. I think you put your finger on something there, Sam. That's the point, really. It was intended to be much more fully fledged. It was intended, if you like, to be the wedding cake centerpiece. Certainly, as far as Germany, I should say, also the Poles have got a big stake in this. They love their young people being able to go to and fro, get their English fluent, and be able to study and work in the UK. So there's been quite a lot of pressure from both from Warsaw and Berlin, and we're in heads of terms kind of territory. But that's always a sign that you haven't really worked out the other stuff in detail. I think the briefing that Britain is being a bit stuckist on this. A lot of it is coming from German diplomats. I know because I hear them. They've been reluctant to take on board that this is seen as part of the wider British immigration debate. They've always said, look, it's a visa arrangement. It's limited. The numbers are limited. It's only young people, etc., etc. The question is whether haggling now about time limits will be enough to get this over the line. And I think Keir Starmer, if you look at what has been going on in asylum and immigration policy and his tone in the last few days on that, he's not going to want to have a long-running conversation, is he, about how long this scheme is going to be for. He will want everything to be nailed down when he goes into sell mode. And anyway, in practical terms, it is true that these things are time limited, but you know what happens when youth mobility schemes and young people, so I've heard, end up getting to quite like each other when they go to each other's countries. So you also have that, you're going to have more people who will settle in the other country by means of marriage or other ways. So I think you have to be open about the fact it's not a big immigration plan, but it does have that effect in some ways of more people simply moving around, and that is politically a bit difficult for Keir Starmer at the moment, which is why it's taking so long.
There are two bits of difficulty, I think, in this. One is the migration stuff that you're just talking about, and I think Tories and Reform will kind of go great guns against anything that looks like it's increasing net migration. And the whole of the thrust of the internal government discussion is there a way of creating a scheme that doesn't hit the net migration numbers by limiting it to less than a year? The other bit that's going to be tricky is Keir Starmer bluntly going back on a promise and signing up to EU rules in perpetuity when it comes to agriculture and foods. The ghastly technocratic phrase dynamic alignment. Now, Keir Starmer's office in opposition briefed me that there was going to be no dynamic alignment, but it looks as if that's exactly what he's going to sign up to. And rule taking, having to follow EU rules despite not being in the EU, is something that opposition parties and newspapers like The Sun think that the public will not stand for because we have left the EU and because of Brexit. And that's one of the things I think that Kemi Badenoch will go at. My question for you, Anne, is a broader one. Kemi Badenoch has sort of this week made great guns that she would, when she becomes Prime Minister, if she becomes Prime Minister, rip up any parts of the deal that she didn't like, and was making that very clear to the EU ambassador in London. Do you think the EU will pay any attention to what Kemi Badenoch is saying? And does the fact that one of the two, maybe one of the three main parties, or maybe two of the three main parties in the UK, if we think politics has changed for good, oppose what Keir Starmer's signing up to?
Really interesting question, that. I think EU diplomats have been badly burnt by misunderstanding, and EU governments, therefore, by underestimating the impact of random Tory leaders they did not expect to fly quite as well or dramatically as they did. See one Boris Johnson for further details. Where is Boris Johnson, by the way? Expect to be hearing from him soon in all this turmoil. I think in the case of Kemi Badenoch, they can listen to the podcast and read the news and the analysis like anyone else. They're probably more interested and concerned about the March of Reform UK, which they see as part of a wider realignment on the right of politics across a lot of Europe, which is why Poland's a bit of an interesting example because it's going the other way at the moment. But I think they are probably not thinking, oh my goodness, Kemi Badenoch is going to sweep to power and undo all of this. They may be thinking, what on earth happens? It's a lot more mysterious and a lot more suggestive, but what happens if Nigel Farage somehow manages to sweep his way to power?
Right. That was the 20-minute alarm. Much, much more urgently, I've just had a message from upstairs going, where is my coffee? So I cannot hang around any longer. The coffee needs to be delivered to other people who live in this house. So we're going to wrap it up there. You'll be in Poland tomorrow. I'll still be in London. So I will speak to you then. Have a fantastic time.
I'm off and I will be having my Polish dumplings and maybe the odd sneaky Polish beer on the side after the conference. See you tomorrow.
See you then.
The first 100 days might be over, but President Trump is showing no signs of slowing down.
America will soon be greater than ever before.
So we're continuing to follow every twist and turn of this remarkable presidency.
And trying to make sense of what it all means for the US and for the rest of the world.
So join me, James Matthews.
Me, Malta Kellner.
And me, Mark Stone.
For Sky News Trump 100, wherever you get your podcasts.